Good evening and welcome to the Mint Museum Uptown at Levine Center for the Arts. I'm Rob Harrington, the chair of the Arts and Science Council Board of Directors. On behalf of our partners for this evening's event, the Mint Museum, the McCall Center for Art and Innovation, the Beckler Museum of Modern Art, and the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Art and Culture, thank you for joining us for this one-of-a-kind experience celebrating the career of Richard Hunt, one of the most important African American sculptors of the 20th century, and his newly installed artwork, Spiral Odyssey, a tribute to his friend Romare Bearden and located in Romare Bearden Park. The co-directors of the Bearden Foundation are here this evening, Deirdre Harris Kelly, Romare Bearden's niece, and Joanne Bryant Reed. Thank you for joining us this evening. I understand that there may also be elected officials in the room this evening, and if there are any, I'd invite you to stand and be recognized. I know there are folks who are on the way and they may not be here yet. ASC is grateful for its partnership with Mecklenburg County and with the City of Charlotte to ensure culture for all. I also want to thank our generous sponsors for this evening's event. The Land Design team worked with Seattle-based artist Nori Sato to master plan Romare Bearden Park and the fact that it includes themes from Mr. Bearden's life. Moore and Van Allen, a supporter of the cultural community and provider of creative solutions to complex legal challenges and high-quality legal services in a multitude of practice areas. And finally, QCityMetro.com, the leading source of news, opinion, and other information relevant to the Charlotte region's thriving African American community. The Arts and Science Council seeks to ensure that all residents and visitors to the Charlotte area have access to vibrant, excellent, relevant, and sustainable cultural community. We do that in many ways, including public art. Public art is our opportunity to write many narratives into one overarching story of this place that we call home. Public art plays an important role in the vibrancy and energy of our community. It helps create livable cities, enhances neighborhoods, creates a sense of place, and enriches the spirit and pride of our residents. The Arts and Science Council is proud to manage the public art program for the City of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County through the Public Art Commission and enhanced public spaces for residents and visitors to enjoy. Through our collaboration with the Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation Department, we had the honor of working with Richard Hunt, who's here this evening. In addition to Mecklenburg County Public Art Ordinance funds, contributions were generously provided for this project by the Duke Energy Foundation, the North Carolina Arts Commission, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Board of Directors, the members of the Board of Directors of the Arts and Science Council. Spiral Odyssey is the signature work for Romare Bearden Park, and we welcome it to our community. Now our public art installations number 137 pieces of art. Thank you for tonight's discussion, and now I'd ask for Senior Curator of American Modern and Contemporary Art, Jonathan Spelman, to provide a few words on behalf of the Mint Museum. Jonathan.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jonathan Spelman here from the Mint Museum, and it's a pleasure to have all of you with us tonight. We're absolutely thrilled when we were asked if we would serve as the venue for this important discussion, and we're just absolutely delighted to be able to have three such distinguished discussants here to my right, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say about Richard's work, Bearden's work, and how it all fits together. I watched with delight as Bearden Park came together, as the Mint Museum Uptown was rising, and was thrilled when we learned that Richard Hunt was chosen as the sculptor to put the final piece of that puzzle in place. And it was a perfect marriage, and it's been thrilling to watch it come to life over the past 6 or 7 years. I do want to make sure to invite you all to come back after tonight. Make sure you can come to the dedication of the sculpture tomorrow from 10 to 11 at Bearden Park, and then come on over back to the museum if you hadn't had a chance to come upstairs and see Romare Bearden's Odysseus suite watercolors, which are on view on our fourth floor galleries and our John Biggers exhibition as well. We also tomorrow have Jazzin' on the Terrace, a tribute to Richard Hunt and Romare Bearden, performances at noon and 1:30 tomorrow. And we've also recently just opened the exhibition of the work of William Ivy Long, costume designs for Broadway and television. Will be free tomorrow during Smithsonian Museum Day Live, and so we welcome all of you to come back for those events, and we also have a talk by William Ivy Long here at 2:30. So without further ado, I'm happy to welcome my colleague, former colleague here at the Mint, and now colleague at large in the community, Carla Hansel from the ASC, to introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. 4 years ago, on September 2nd, 2013, on what would have been Romare Bearden's 102nd birthday, Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation Department opened Romare Bearden Park. Richard Hunt was commissioned to create a monumental sculpture in homage to Bearden. Mr. Hunt was born in 1935, a generation younger than Bearden, but both artists share the distinction of being considered masters of their respective practices. Hunt employs an improvisational technique used by jazz musicians and also used by Bearden in creating his collages. Hunt, like Bearden, is also drawn to mythology and epic tales and embraces both figuration and abstraction. Best known for his abstract steel sculptures done in steel and bronze, Hunt is widely considered one of the greatest living American sculptors, having earned more public commissions than any other sculptor in the U.S. Last year, Hunt created a monumental suspended work that is in the atrium of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Many years back, in 1971, both Bearden and Richard Hunt shared the honor of being the first two African American artists to be invited to have solo exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It was an amazing accomplishment in terms of really breaking the color barrier for such an impressive institution. The Spiral Odyssey that Hunt created as tribute to his friend in his namesake park stands out among his over 135 commissions. In his artist statement, Hunt clarifies that the Odyssey in the title refers to Romare Bearden's series of work that took Homer's epic poem as a point of inspiration and departure. Odyssey is also a way to refer to Bearden's personal journey alone and with others, his peers and his artistic offspring, and his world of admirers. Spiral has multiple associations. It also refers to the pivotal role of the joining together of African American artists in 1963 in New York to share ideas on arts activism in the context of the civil rights movement. Also considered is the widening, elevating spiral of Bearden's multifaceted career, which even in its legacy phase continues to ascend. To share with Richard Hunt some of these important threads of conversation, we've invited two distinguished guests, Mary Schmidt Campbell and Robert O'Mealy. Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell is president of Spelman College, a leading college dedicated to the education and global leadership of Black women. Before coming to Spelman, she served for over 2 decades as Dean of New York University's Tisch School of Arts. An art historian and former curator, Dr. Campbell began her career in New York as executive director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, the country's first accredited Black fine arts museum. She served as commissioner of New York City's Department of Cultural Affairs under 2 mayors, and in 2009 was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as vice chair of the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities. Dr. Campbell has lectured widely about Black artists, cultural policy, and arts education. Currently, Dr. Campbell is completing a biography of Romare Bearden for Oxford University Press. And a number of her alumni are here, the Charlotte chapter, so there you all are. Welcome. And Dr. Robert G. O'Mealy is a Zora Neal Hurston Professor of Literature at Columbia University, as well as the director of the Columbia Center for Jazz Studies. His books include Lady Day, The Many Faces of Billie Holiday, The Craft of Ralph Ellison, and Romare Bearden, A Black Odyssey. He has edited or co-edited many volumes, including Jazz Cadence of American Culture, History, and Memory, and African American Culture, and the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. In recent years, Emily has served as co-curator for Arts at Jazz in Lincoln Center and has curated exhibitions for the Smithsonian Institution. His book, Romare Bearden Reader, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. So we'll now welcome our speakers and encourage you to begin a lively discussion. We want to keep it conversational, and I know it's going to be thrilling. I can't imagine a better team of people to talk with Richard. So.
Thanks so much, Carla. Thank you. Our framework will be very simple. I'll say a few words. I'll invite Dr. Schmidt Campbell, to say a few words, and then we'll get to hear from the artist. The purpose of this evening is to make the sculpture more available to everybody. So everything that we'll be doing will be designed to open up this wonderful piece and make it something that we can enjoy all the more. I have to say how honored I feel just to sit here with these two great people. It's an awesome responsibility and a delight. So I'm very happy to be here with you. It's also a great day for Charlotte as an arts city that has beautiful vistas and beautiful works all over town. Wherever you walk, there are fountains and pieces, and so it's just great to be part of that ongoing scenario as well. Toni Morrison said that she had to write Beloved because there wasn't, at the time that she wrote it anyway, what she called a bench by the road where you could go and sit down and reflect on the meaning of African American life. There was no place to go. Now that isn't true now. We can think of museums and other places where you can go and reflect on these things, but they're far too few. And so it seems to me significant to remark again that here we have a magnificent place, more than a bench by the road, but all the beautiful places to sit and stand and walk, and observe this piece which commemorates African American life, but which does so in such a broad frame of reference, so that you're not looking at it and feeling cut off from everybody else. He wants to open it up and make it available to everybody. This is very Bearden-like, to try to connect African American experience in its most immediate textures with the responsibility, with the experiences of people everywhere. The name of the piece, as you've heard, is Spiral Odyssey. We could spend our whole time just talking about, as Carla has already done so well, about spiral and odyssey. That's enough. If you have a rich sense of those two words, then you'll have a rich sense of what this piece means. I'm going to take my next couple of minutes and last couple of prefatory minutes to say a word about the Odyssey. First of all, Bearden said when he was asked how it felt to come back home to Charlotte, now that he lived in New York, he said, "What do you mean? I never left Charlotte. I live here in my imagination all the time. I think about it, and he was certainly aware that the places where he lived are gone, or now are parking lots and whatnot. But this is the place that fired his imagination as much as any place ever did. And so the idea of going out and coming back home and going out again is Homer's story, and Bearden's in his series of collages. Some of you know that Bearden did a series of collages followed by the watercolors that are on display in this museum, depicting the storyline of the Odyssey. I want to take a second and show some of those images and think about those. First of all, here is this piece. Please have this in mind. Spiral Odyssey. The spiral is easy to see, and Mr. Hunt said to me the other day, I got more spiral than Odyssey maybe going on. But anyway, let's look at the Odyssey part of it for a moment. Here is Bearden's collage called Return to Ithaca. And if we think of this work as a work about the person of the world, man or woman, trying to find a sense of feeling at home wherever you are, trying to feel at home, and the uneasiness that can bring. Anybody who's gone away and gone back home knows what I mean. Odysseus goes out, comes back, and then goes out again. So the sense of a homeless figure. Bearden made all of his characters in the Odyssey as black as he could make them. He used the blackest paper he could find to make the point that this is a universal story. It's our story. And so that's something to think about, I think, as you look at Mr. Hunt's sculpture, that it's a story of travel, it's a story of water. You can see a boat, I believe, in the sculpture. There's a sense of the movement, the swirling of water, and of this sense of a journey home. In Homer's Odyssey, the character of the Cyclops is a monster that Odysseus has to escape from. And because he does him wrong and puts out his eye, he spends the rest of the epic being chased by the Cyclops' father, the sea god. Bearden makes the Cyclops a child, as if to say, why didn't you just keep going? Why didn't you leave him alone? They went there to take everything they could from the Cyclops. And I think this is Bearden's way of saying, I've got the perspective of everybody in mind. So this is a search for home, but it includes everybody, and including a sense of sympathy for the weakest ones and the strangest ones, as if to say, somebody who's so different from you, you don't know what they're doing. That's part of your family too. It's very different, than you have to include them too and take care of them rather than chase them around. And because Odysseus didn't see things that way, the Cyclops' father was the sea god, and he said, everybody else will forgive Odysseus, but I will not. So if you look closely at the sculpture, there seems to be a sea god's trident. There's a boat, and there seems to be some kind of movement, and perhaps there is this sense of an African looking for home and also very unhappy about the way his children have been treated. Some people see all the water in Bearden's series as a place where the many thousands who lost their lives in the Middle Passage are remembered. And Poseidon is not happy about it. It's so great that we have a kind of celebration of black women wherever Dr. Schmidt Campbell appears. Because Bearden made clear that in the midst of all this, there's a black woman who will reach down and save you. The ship is wrecked in the upper right-hand corner. He's diving, he's fallen in the water, and the sister dives down and says, just hold on to this cloth and follow me. And notice that she's got a kente cloth with her, which is part of the story here too. So as you look at the sculpture, think about the movement of the wind and the water and the search for home, and it is not a hopeless search. The spiral moves around and also upward. There's a sense of progress implied. And so I invite you, the more you know about the Bearden Odyssey and Homer's Odyssey, I think the more you'll see here in these swirls of wind and water, and in this search for a way to find peace in a very difficult and turbulent situation that's expressed by this statue.
I'm sorry, I'm just so captivated by
I know.
Richard Hunt's sculpture. Thank you, Robert. I have to say, first and foremost, it is so wonderful to be back in Charlotte. I can't think of another American city that has done more to celebrate one of its great artists than Charlotte has done for Romare Bearden, and certainly the Mint Museum as well. And I just want to applaud the city of Charlotte and the Mint Museum. It's just been great to be here. Really wonderful. I haven't seen this sculpture, but I have seen Bearden Park, which I just think every time somebody says they're going to Charlotte, I say, go to see Bearden Park. But it's also wonderful to be here with Robert, because I have been just so totally enthralled by his study of Bearden's Odyssey series. His study of the collages, of the watercolors, of the sketches, and he just really has embraced that and really dived deeply and given us such a substantive understanding. So I want to thank you, Robert. And this is a legend, right? You know, Richard Hunt, yeah, he's... I hope it's not too dark out after this, because I'm going to now run over to Bearden Park and try to, get a glimpse of Spiral Odyssey. So I just want to say 3 things by way of introduction this evening. And the first is, in 1971, when Richard Hunt and Romare Bearden had their retrospectives at the Museum of Modern Art, that was a momentous occasion. Up to that point, I was a graduate student at that time. You could walk into every single museum in New York City, and you would not find the work of an African-American artist, and you may find a few works by women. And you certainly would not have had a retrospective overview of the works of an African-American artist. So this was a huge event, and as I was writing my book and doing a little research, they had cameras from BBC and all over the United States. It was like a big deal. And I want to say that because we, as a country, a culture, have also gone on an odyssey. There has been, since 1971 to now, where Richard's sculpture is in Bearden Park, and it's in the National Museum, and it's, we're used to seeing African-American artists, everywhere in our culture, to understand that we have come from one place to another place. So I just want to begin by saying that, so we don't lose that historical perspective. The second thing is the Odyssey, and Robert knows far more about Homer's Odyssey than I do. But I want to talk about Odyssey as a metaphor for what Bearden called at one point in a piece of correspondence to a friend of his, Harry Henderson, his voyage of discovery. Because what was really apparent, one of the most things that was really enlightening for me in writing the biography was to see the extent to which he really did travel. He really did allow himself to move from being a political cartoonist to doing naturalistic work, to doing these literary abstractions, to a long period of time, almost a decade, when he really was trying to figure out what kind of artist he was going to be. And when you showed that picture of the woman diving down, of the goddess diving down to save him, I thought of the image of his marriage to Nanette Rohan, who literally shepherded him back to painting, to rediscover painting, abstract at first, and his continuing journey to find, finally, at the age of 53, the medium of collage. So that wonderful sense that an artist's life can be that kind of unfolding journey from one medium to the next, from one way of thinking about the arts to the next, was really a wonderful discovery. So in a sense, the Odyssey is the perfect metaphor for, in fact, the way his entire life has unfolded. And finally, I just want to say one word about Spiral. The Spiral artists came together because a group of them thought they might want to go down to the March on Washington in 1963. But when they came together, it was really the first time in a long time that Romare and Norman Lewis and Hale Woodruff and Charles Alston and a bunch of other artists had gotten together again as a community of artists. And it really kind of alerted me to the fact that there's much of what artists do that's solitude, that's solitary, and it's by yourself. But there's an aspect of the arts that is so much a part of community. And the Spiral brought these artists, black artists, together again as a community. And it was probably the most important catalytic moment in Bearden's life to allow him to let his collages flourish, because it was a year after that that he opened his first exhibit of collages. So that meaning Spiral Odyssey has many, many layers, many, many meanings, and I think it's an incredible, I can't stop looking at this piece. This is an incredible piece, but also I think in naming it Spiral Odyssey, I think you really found something that is really core to the experience of Bearden and your connection to him. So, thank you.
So, by way of transition, I would say to, especially to students present, please do look up Spiral. You'll find ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes writing about the spiral. You'll find people writing about spirals of history and circles and so on, and you'll find DNA patterns, and you'll find images of the universe and images in nature of plants and animals. And then once you get this other part too, the sense of the spiral group, which is just so important, I think there's a lot to learn, as much as there is to learn about Odyssey. By the way, Bearden once said, I knew Bearden just a bit. You knew him much better than I did. He said, painting is an old man's art. And I think what he might have meant is that, you just keep learning.
That's right.
And eventually, if you're lucky, you may get there.
Right.
And of course, with Bearden, the thing I was struck by at an abstraction show that I went to a couple weeks ago is the things that he says I wasn't there yet are also so fantastically good. Mm-hmm. So Bearden of the 40s and 50s and 60s, before the collages, I think is fantastically rich. I might start our conversation with Richard Hunt by asking about your influences. It's easy to learn that you were involved with the Art Institute of Chicago. You might say a word about that, but I was fascinated to learn about your parents and the role that they might have played in your development as an artist.
Yeah, okay, so to begin at the beginning, parents who had come to Chicago in what they now term the Great Migration. They didn't know that that's what they were doing when they left rural Georgia in, 1920s or rural Illinois. My father, rural Georgia. My mother, rural Illinois. But anyway, they ended up in Chicago looking, for work, education, opportunities. And they were of that generation, and we've talked about it, how our parents really wanted their offspring to have a chance and pushed them to do more or better than they could or did. They were interested in, making a living, making a home for a family, and being involved in the social, religious, political life of Chicago South Side. When I was born, my parents lived in Woodlawn. Later on, we lived in Englewood, and then for a time, actually, we moved back to the area where my mother was from. They lived in the country, but Galesburg, Illinois. But anyway. My mother was interested in more of the performing arts and the visual arts, but encouraged any kind of interest in all those things. So from the time I was a kid, we'd go to the museums, the Art Institute, and things other than when I took art classes in school. Another thing to talk about a generation coming up. I mean, look at the Chicago public schools around. Like in high school, you had to take a year of art and a year of music. That was part of the curriculum. Now it's STEM, which, well, we'll see whether that works. But anyway, there was all that, and then there happened to be. I did all that, and I had. Some encouragement from art teachers in school and things. Then my mother enrolled me in what was called the junior school at the Art Institute on Saturdays in the summer. I would take classes there, and for one thing, the school was in the museum, and so you'd walk past all this art to get to the classrooms and spend time going over the field museum, drawing animals and whatever else was there. And anyway, there was just a lot of nourishment in terms of things to think about, see, maybe try to emulate, that kind of thing. So that was, and at a certain point, I have to say, I did have this interest in, well, biology and in history, and music to a certain extent. Now, I would draw and stuff like that, and it seemed to get better. I would practice my violin and it didn't get any better. So after the point, I left that. It made a music lover out of me, but no desire to go forward with that. So I spent more time with drawing and that sort of thing. But anyway, when I was in high school, one of the drawing teachers said, well, you know, you ought to try sculpture. So then I took a sculpture class at the Junior School of the Art Institute. And it happened to be an interesting time, too, there, because there were people who taught in the professional school at the Art Institute that would also teach some of these classes. And then it was an interesting time by then, late 40s, right after the Second World War. There were a lot of people who actually ended up in America, artists, who left Europe, whether it was communist Russia or anti-Jewish Germany. So anyway, I ended up having a good fortune of having a wonderful sculpture teacher, a woman named Nellie Barr, who was born in Cologne, and she and her husband were involved with the Bauhaus, then lived in Paris. When the Germans got to Paris, they had to flee, to keep from going to concentration camp. But anyway, they ended up, after being in South America, Japan and all, taken in by some Quakers in Philadelphia, but ended up in Chicago and reunited with people they knew at the Bauhaus. And so anyway, I was a high school kid, and I had this teacher who had all this background experience. She worked with Maillot in Paris and all. So I just started making sculpture, and here I am.
Let me back up for just a moment and summarize some of the things that you went by rather quickly. Your mother was involved in the performing arts.
Well, we don't have much time.
Oh, no, I know. We got to go. Your mother was a musician and did dramatic readings. So you're in a household where you were seeing that sort of thing go on. And it struck me when you were saying, when we talked the other day, that it was important to you that your mother had been a beautician.
Right.
And so those heads can be mighty sculptural in the beauty shop. And your father worked in the barbershop.
Right, yeah.
So you'd walk, whether it was one kind of cut or a little concholine going on.
Right.
There's a lot to see.
You know what struck me as I was listening to you talk about your early years, Richard, is that how rich they were in terms of what was available to you in your public school, at the Chicago Art Institute, on the Saturday classes. As you said, there were a wave of European immigrants who came over, during World War II and just after, and so they kind of saturated a lot of the urban areas. So, and that's an interesting phenomenon, because Bearden also experienced that a few years earlier, but there was a lot of rich opportunities for young people who were in urban areas at that time, and it's just striking if you look at the comparison between then and now.
You also said somewhere, I don't want to cut you off, but you said somewhere that when you would visit your relatives in the South, there was an uncle or a grandfather who was not a sculptor, but who was very capable. Can you?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, they built their houses there in Georgia. and carpentry, and all those kind of skills.
People could do things.
Yeah,
They can make things.
Yeah, and it would be wood that they'd cut and took to a mill and had, planed in the boards and, built, and anyway, yeah. So when you think about it, I mean, making sculpture is like making a lot of other things. Yeah, but I mean, and there was this kind of so you use your head, your hands, and your heart to make sculpture, and I think good craftsmen do that too, yeah. So being around all that, yeah, and of course, I actually seeing things grow, being a farmer,
You saw the plants as sculpture works.
Well, at the time I saw them as plants, but then, no, but now I see everything as sculpture.
Oh.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, right.
That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah. No, they became sculpture over time. They certainly did. Yeah.
And to Mary's point, we're so often sometimes beaten to death with the deprivation of the scene and nothing is available. But you grew up with this incredible, I think I'll take a sculpture class, and then you took a sculpture class, which was simply available, and there were people all around you involved in the arts, and people who were fleeing political oppression, and so it's something else to splice into that I think Bearden understood too, that here's a group of people who were involved in politics, but they're trying to make their statement as big as they can in the arts. So it's just, to me, that's the kind of headline story, that it was an incredibly rich scene that you grew up with. The musical reference was brought up by Carla and others. How would you? Is that you said that you have become a good listener, and I know you appreciate Baroque music in particular, and you're a Handel lover. Does that work? Is that something that we can see when we look at the sculpture?
Yeah, it depends on how you look at it, right? I mean, that is to say, yeah. I mean, these things that we've been talking about, the spiraling, and of course the fact that it's taken in. I mean, if you look at it over time, just like a musical composition unfolds over time. I mean, that is to say, it takes place in time, and
walk
so
around it.
yeah, right. I mean, and of course, that's an interesting thing that we see. We see images of sculpture all the time, but we see a side that some photographer has chosen, or the light is a certain way at a certain time, and all that. But there are some of what I might call dynamics within the sculpture that have a kind of corollary to some of what I hear and experience in listening to music. Yeah, So yeah, so like I say, I would say, my technique is what it is, working directly in metal, welding, fabricating things for the most part. But then there are things that influence the outcome, that come from then all the other things that I experience that lead me to use, fairly common techniques, like welding, fabricating, in the particular way that I use it, and to bend something so it fits a certain subject or attitude that I want to express in the work.
So as you were talking about that, I was looking at the material and looking at the surfaces, and I'm curious to know, when you choose the materials that you choose, what motivates you? So, for example, for Spiral Odyssey, what motivated you to use these materials?
Steel, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as a matter of fact, in terms of a lot of the public sculpture that I do, I mean, say the last, at least 15 years, most of the things have been made out of stainless steel. I mean, for the first larger scale things I did were in Corten steel, which was kind of in vogue at the time. Some of the first large pieces were in the middle to late 60s and on through the 70s. Then I started to use bronze, so one of the things about the stainless is that it's low maintenance, and the surface can be manipulated in a lot of ways. As a matter of fact, in the piece here, I mean, there are a variety of different approaches to the surface. And in the end, after putting it all together, welding it, shaping forms, welding it together, you go over and you can, with like sanding discs or various things that you do the surface with, almost draw on it, so that there are lines that go one way or another. Then they reflect the light in different ways, and that's a quality that the surface of stainless steel has and exhibits that bronze, which absorbs the light, doesn't, and it patinas, whether you artificially patina it or certainly outdoors, the environment takes over. So anyway, the choice of something like stainless steel for this project, when the sun's shining on it, it's bright in the daytime, or the street lights reflecting from it at night, give it a presence that it wouldn't have if it was some other material.
So it would have a kind of changing presence in there.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about the choice to use an abstract figure or abstract imagery. If you go to Louis Armstrong Park in New Orleans, you go to the park and there's a portrait of Louis Armstrong, 10 times the size of life, and it's wonderful to see that. And I wonder, for you, can you talk a bit about the decision not to make it so realistic, but instead to work another way?
Yeah, well, I mean, that goes back to, my formative years when I sort of saw, as a kid, as a high school kid in my junior school sculpture class, we model things in clay and plaster, and there were figures, you'd do a figure or a portrait bust or something like that. And as a matter of fact, a lot of schools then were, carrying on, kind of a Beaux-Arts method of education. The Art Institute was. It was in the kind of transition. As a matter of fact, there'd be teachers like some I had who were, modernists, and the other people would say, "Don't take their class," and they say, "Don't take the other." But anyway, as a matter of fact, it's interesting too. When I was in my first year in the college at the Art Institute, there was an exhibition that was a eye opener or watershed or whatever. There was actually a curator who at the time was at the Museum of Modern Art, Andrew Kadriff Ritchie, who did a show called Sculpture of the 20th Century, which brought together all of the modern movements, sculptors practicing, from the late 1800s, up to the World War II years, and a little bit beyond, and so there were of greatest interest to me was a piece by Julio Gonzalez, the Montserrat, which was this hammered iron thing of a Montserrat woman holding a child, and sheets of metal formed. It was a figurative work, but it was abstracted. And part of it had to do with the fact that there were these sheets of metal formed, into what would be limbs and a skirt and like the forms of the material, but you'd have the feeling of the figure beneath it. But at the same time, it was simplified and stark and gave a certain expression and emotion that you wouldn't have had if you'd modeled it in clay and cast it in bronze. It would anyway. So that and it turned out he came to Paris along at the same time Picasso. They knew one another in Barcelona, and he helped Picasso with some of his welded things. And he came from a family of blacksmiths and silversmiths. Gonzalez did. And there were pieces in that show like the Monument to Apollinaire, the linear piece that Picasso did, or modeled for a monument. That was something he never got to do, but anyway. And then there was like David Smith, and then some of a group of young British sculptors who were making a name for themselves, like Reg Butler and Chadwick at the time. So, like I say, this was early 50s. And what question was I answering?
You were saying why you chose abstraction.
Right.
Mary wanted to make a point.
So I have a confession to make at this point about abstraction. Yes, it's a confession about abstraction versus representation, right? So in '71, when the show went up, as I said, I was a graduate student, and I was actually a little bit indignant that the Museum of Modern Art had decided to do two black artists at the same time, one who had work that had black figures in it and one that was abstract, because it felt a little bit like, oh, we'll cover both bases. We'll do one with some figures in it and one that's abstract, and everybody will be happy.
Well,
and that was, I was a graduate student, so I confess.
But you were exactly right. No, I mean, what I mean is, the background too was that black artists had been protesting that,
right?
Just what you talked about, that they're being shunned aside or not recognized or not looked at or not whatever. And of course, there was something called a civil rights movement in the late 60s. And so...
I was there.
Yeah, so there was a decision, board of directors, staff, that, we've got to respond to this somewhere or other. So we'll have this show. And of course, it's interesting that it was at that time, that Romare was developing this body of figurative work. What was the title of his exhibition? Persistence of Memory.
Prevalence of Ritual.
Prevalence of Ritual. Persistence, that's another surrealist painting.
Okay.
But prevalence of ritual. And of course, the thing is, talking about his moving around, I mean, before that he'd been painting these abstract paintings, some of which you saw. And there was a beautiful one in the show at the Museum of Modern Art not long ago of abstract expressionism. Just an abstract painting. If you didn't read the label, you might have thought it was by Cy Twombly or something. No, you wouldn't have thought that. But what I mean is, though, a lot of people have been, born and raised on Bearden's figurative work, and I'm glad to see, though, that this whole range is now, being offered in exhibitions like the one you just saw.
And so for you, he was an abstract painter too, figurative.
And of course that's part of the title Spiral. So people will say, "Well, what's that?" And then they might, go back. As a matter of fact. As we were talking about Spiral and the Spiral, Hale Woodworth, one of the people, wrote about why. There's something you can read. I can't tell you just where to go, but you'll know. He can tell you. He's the academician. Well, you both are. But what I mean is he wrote about the Archimedean spiral and all that. There's this whole thing about getting around to why these guys would go over to Bearden's place and all sit around talking about abstract art. But anyway, and what it could mean to them. But at that point in time.
The other thing that's interesting to me is how once you start looking at the abstraction, there's a fishtail, there's a plant, there's a wave, there's a boat. You begin to see that the abstraction is based on something.
Well, one thing to say is that nothing is abstract, and of course, nothing is real either.
Everything is abstract on some level. Yeah. Could you tell us about when we talked the other day? I said, "Well, you listen to music? Are you influenced by literature?" And you said, "You know what? I get up in the morning and I go to work in my studio, and I work for hours at a time." And I'd like to, if you take a moment and just talk about your work day and perhaps say a word about your process of creating something like this.
Okay. Well, yeah, and people ask me about what kind of music do I listen to when I'm working, and one of the things that I regret is that in making sculpture the way I do, hammering on it, welding, grinding, you make so much noise you can't hear the music. So it's like after hours or before. As a matter of fact, I used to have some music on, and there'd be a beautiful passage. And was I going to hammer on this thing, or was I going to wait till, and so in an effort to be more efficient, I just didn't turn the radio on until I stopped for dinner or lunch or something like that. But anyway, but the idea of sculpture, being a workman-like thing. I talked before about relatives or workers of one kind or another, and as a matter of fact, growing up as a kid, I would help clean up the barber shop and shine shoes, stuff like that, and like before there was a barbers union, barbers would work from 9 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Saturday.
You're used to hard work. Seen it.
Yeah, I mean it wasn't as hard as shoveling coal, but you're standing there all day. But anyway, So I mean. The idea of, mostly standing all day and mostly working, it turns out to be just something you do,
You mentioned Julio Gonzalez earlier. What other artists' work are you drawn to? What artists do you feel kind of like nourishes you? You go back to over and over again?
Well, as a matter of fact, it was interesting. A lot of the early modernist sculptors died young. I mean, either in the First World War or and a lot of them were warmongers, like Boccioni. Great sculptor. But war was a cleansing, all that kind of stuff. So sculptors can be dumb son of bitches too. But anyway. But things like his unique continuity, that was a piece I was very much interested in, or development of a bottle in space. Matter of fact, which has spirals.
Right. Yeah.
So, but I wouldn't say that had anything to, what I mean is that things that you've experienced over a long period of time, there's a certain point in time you're going to make something, and then you put together forms. As a matter of fact, sometimes it'll either be something I did or something, that may be a reference to something I saw. But it's sort of there, and it's not like you thought, I'm going to take this, and this, and put it together like a recipe. But it's more that it is looking at where something is going to go, developing a rationale like to express certain things related to Bearden, but to do it on a certain scale and to do it my way. But things come up in the composition after you stand back and look at it that you can relate to other things that were part of your experience.
When you did the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the piece there,
Right.
What idea were you bringing to that? Because that's such a monumental institution, not only for our community but for the the entire country. It seems so big.
Well, I mean, okay, there's the institution and all, but then there's the thing, about a lot of commissions that there's a place where it's going to go that makes you develop a composition in a certain way. Okay, so in that project there was this this lobby and there was a space 50 feet wide, 50 feet, well, in one direction 50 feet, in another direction, I don't know which is the width and which is the length. But anyway, 50 by 60 feet and 21 feet high. And the idea, there's a programmatic thing about it. Okay, this is a space where people gather, where they come in. It's an event space and all like that. So you don't want to have a sculpture standing in the middle of it because either you'd have to move it to have a party or bring it or wet. Okay. So anyway, they thought, as it was presented to me, that they would like to have a sculpture that hung from the ceiling. Then the building code says you can't have anything, whether it's a chandelier or a sculpture, that's lower than 12.5 feet from the floor. And they've got their formula for that. It had to be tall enough so a tall basketball player couldn't reach up there. or some kids get on one another's shoulder. Any number of things. But anyway, so I decided, after doing a variety of studies, models, to make a piece which would be 6.5 feet high and 35 feet in either direction. And I wanted to have some movement, so there's some movements that could be called a number of things, but I decided to have a reference to African American history and culture by calling it Swing Low, as in the title of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And so that's what it's just called, Swing Low, and of course people think about Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and it's welded bronze and it hangs there and suspended from the ceiling by 5 aircraft cables, and it weighs 2,500 pounds. Like you said, not
I'm getting a signal that we're really out of time.
Okay.
But I do want to ask you if you'll give us our last word. If you were going to, here's our chance to hear from the artist. Is there something that you particularly would like us to look for as we look at this work of yours?
Well, like I talked about, sculpture ideally being at least a sculpture of some size in a space like the park, being something that you ought to experience, 360 degrees. I mean, so walk around it, and then the fact that it's there to be experienced in different times of day, different climatic conditions is something too. There are people that walk by it on their way to work every day. They'll see more of it than but the idea of thinking about it as something to experience in the round, something to move around, and as a matter of fact, one might even say too that there's as far as the composition goes. There'll be sections that are kind of units within themselves that are part of the larger thing, but there'll be a concentration of forms that are interacting one way in one place, and then they'll look differently from another place. And so, spend a little time with it, I guess you'd say. Well, as a matter of fact, one of the things a lot of people will say, I guess I could even call it a pet peeve. They'll say, well, what's the front,
It sounds almost like a collage in its different elements.
Well, we've been talking about that before, but she picked up on That's why she's Mary Schmidt Campbell.
That's why she's the president.
Yeah, that's right. Mrs. President, Madam President. Yes, indeed.
I want to thank both my fellow panelists. It's such a great thing to hear from the artist and to hear from the great critic of Bearden. We've had a lovely time together.
Yes,
thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here.
On behalf of the Public Art Commission and the Arts and Science Council, I want to thank Dr. Campbell, Mr. Hunt, Dr. O'Mealy, for such an invigorating, enlightening, and lively discussion. We are thrilled by any measure to have the sculpture Spiral Odyssey as part of the Mecklenburg County Public Art Collection. We have a Richard Hunt sculpture in Charlotte. Tonight's event celebrates his great achievement and establishes the layered complexity that this magnificent work of art establishes for all of us. Tomorrow morning, beginning promptly at 10 a.m., we will have the formal public dedication of the sculpture, so we hope that you will all attend. The University Park Baptist Choir will be performing. Our county manager will be there. County commissioners will be there. We are declaring it Richard Hunt Day, so please come out. And then, of course, there's the jazz tribute back here at noon, so please come to that as well. And now join us for a reception in the Robert Haywood Morrison Atrium. And on your way out, the Gantt Center has graciously provided complimentary admission passes for those of you who are interested in going to the Gantt Center, and they'll be at the door on your way out. Thank you for coming this evening.